The morning Ida Leland stopped speaking to the world, the cottonwood trees along the edge of Harlan's Creek were shedding their white tufts like snow in June, and she stood at her husband's grave with her hands folded so tightly together that her knuckles had gone the color of old bone. That was the summer of 1878, in the dusty, sun-cracked town of Caldwell, Kansas, where the cattle trails ran thick with longhorns and the air always carried the smell of leather, horse sweat, and something just faintly like gunpowder. Caldwell sat right on the edge of civilization, a place where men came to drink and deal and occasionally die, and where women like Ida had learned to be harder than the red clay earth beneath their boots just to survive. It was not a town built for softness. But Ida had been soft once, back when Thomas Leland was alive, back when his laugh could fill a room from corner to corner, and his hands were always reaching for hers across the supper table. Thomas had been dead 11 days when Ida finally came back to the house alone after the funeral, and she did not speak again for a very long time. She had spoken plenty in those 11 days, of course. She had spoken to the doctor who had come too late, and to the minister who had come just in time for the burial, and to the women from the church who had brought casseroles and pies, and had stood in her parlor looking at her with that particular expression, that mixture of sorrow and relief that said, quietly, that they were glad it was her and not them. She had spoken to Thomas's younger brother who had ridden down from Wichita, red-eyed and unsteady, and she had spoken to the man at the bank who had informed her, with genuine regret but not enough of it, that Thomas's debts were now hers. She had spoken to all of them with a kind of mechanical grace, her voice moving like a clock that keeps ticking even after the spring has gone slack. But after the funeral, after the last casserole dish had been retrieved and the last condolence had been pressed into her palm like a coin, Ida Leland closed her front door, sat down in the chair by the window that overlooked the street, and simply stopped. She was 29 years old. She had married Thomas at 17, had loved him with the whole burning force of a young woman's heart, had kept his house and planted his garden and bore him 2 children who had both been lost to fever before their 3rd birthdays. She had come through those losses with him beside her, and now she had to come through this one alone, and she simply did not know how to begin. So she did not begin. She sat in the chair. She watched the street. She ate what little she could manage from what remained in her pantry. She slept badly and woke into the gray silence of a world that no longer seemed to contain anything addressed to her. The town moved around her window like a river moves around a stone. Wagons rolled past. Cowboys drove cattle through the main road, in clouds of choking dust. The saloon across the way lit up every evening like a lantern, and she could hear the piano from where she sat, tinny and cheerful, completely indifferent to the fact that Thomas Leland was in the ground. Ida watched it all and said nothing. The first note appeared on the 12th day. She almost missed it. She had come to the door not to open it but to check the bolt, which she checked every morning out of a habit that Thomas had instilled in her years ago. Always check the bolt at dawn and at dusk, he used to say, because in Caldwell you never know what walks the streets before the sun comes fully up. She checked the bolt, and she would have turned away and gone back to her chair except that she noticed the small white rectangle of folded paper that had been slipped under the gap between the door and the porch boards. She stood there for a moment. Then she bent and picked it up. The paper was torn from a page in what looked like a ledger book, the kind that merchants kept for accounts. The handwriting was careful and even, not the scratch of an illiterate man but not the elegant cursive of a schooled one either, somewhere in between, the handwriting of a man who had taught himself and was quietly proud of it. The note was short. It said, "Mrs. Leland, I know you don't know me. I am Dexter Barker. I work at Halloran's stable 2 doors down from the hardware store. I am sorry about your husband. I do not expect a reply." That was all. Ida read it twice. She turned it over and found nothing on the back. She considered the name Dexter Barker and could not immediately place it, which was unusual in a town the size of Caldwell. She set the note on the table by the door and went back to her chair, and for the rest of that day she found herself glancing at the table more than once. She did not reply. The next morning there was another note. She found it in the same place under the door, the same torn ledger paper, the same careful hand. This one said, "I do not mean to bother you. I only wanted to say that the garden on your east side has a few tomato plants that will need water by tomorrow evening or they'll start to wilt. I noticed them from the road. I thought you might want to know." Ida read that one and went immediately to look out the side window. He was right. The tomato plants, which she had started in the spring with Thomas's help, were looking dry and pale at their edges. She stared at them for a long time. Then she went to the kitchen, filled a bucket from the pump, and went out the back door to water them. She did not go out the front. She was not ready for the front, not ready for the street and the eyes of Caldwell and the particular pain of being seen in her grief by people who would want to talk about it. But she watered the tomatoes, and when she came back inside, something in her chest had shifted very slightly, the way a floorboard shifts when you step on it in the dark. She still did not reply. The third note said, "The sky this morning was the color of a peach that's just about perfect. I thought someone should notice it." Ida read that one standing at the door and felt something happen behind her sternum that was dangerously close to an emotion she was not prepared for. She pressed her lips together and folded the note and set it on top of the first two, which she had not thrown away. The fourth note said, "I have a horse named Gerald who kicks over his water bucket every single morning and then looks at me as if I am personally responsible for the fact that it is now empty. I believe he does this on purpose. I have not yet figured out why." Ida read that one and very nearly smiled. She caught herself. The almost smile felt like a betrayal, which she knew was not a rational feeling, but grief rarely is. She put the note with the others. By the end of the second week, there were 8 notes, and Ida had arranged them on the kitchen table in the order she had received them and had read them more times than she would have admitted to anyone living. Each one was different. None of them made demands. None of them offered the particular brand of pity that she could not stand, the kind that made her feel like a problem to be solved or a charity case to be attended to. They were just words, small words. A man's observations about the world, shared with someone he had no real reason to share them with, and asking nothing in return. She had begun, without fully deciding to look forward to the morning. On the 9th note, she almost wrote back. She got as far as taking a piece of paper and a pencil stub from the drawer where Thomas had kept such things, and she sat down at the table and she looked at the blank paper for a long time. Then she put the pencil down and pushed the paper away. It was too soon. It felt too much like stepping out into the light when she had only just begun to exist in the dark. But she kept the paper and pencil on the table. The 10th note made her laugh. It was a real laugh, not the polite social sound she had been making in the days before she stopped speaking, but a genuine thing that surprised her so much she put her hand over her mouth as if to catch it. The note said, "Gerald has now taken to kicking over the water bucket and then standing with one hoof planted firmly in it. I do not know what he is trying to communicate to me, but I am beginning to suspect it is deeply philosophical." She sat in her kitchen with her hand over her mouth and her eyes suddenly wet, and she did not know for a moment whether she was laughing or crying, and then she understood that it was both, and that perhaps those two things had always been closer together than she had previously allowed. She picked up the pencil. She wrote, "Dear Mr. Barker, Gerald sounds like a horse of strong opinions. I have a cat named Mrs. Finch who sleeps exclusively in the spot on the table where I am trying to work. I believe she too is attempting to communicate something, though what exactly I cannot say. Ida Leland." She slid it under her front door before she could think better of it. Then she went back to the kitchen table and sat there with her heart beating considerably faster than seemed entirely appropriate for a widow of 29 who had simply written 3 sentences to a man she had never met. The next morning the note read, "Mrs. Leland, I am enormously glad to hear from you. I will have you know that I do not take this lightly. Mrs. Finch sounds like a woman of considerable authority. Gerald sends his regards. He has graduated to kicking the bucket, stepping in it, and then looking at me as if he expects applause. I believe he may be the most accomplished horse in Caldwell and perhaps in all of Kansas. Dexter Barker. Ida read it 3 times and then wrote back within the hour. She said, "Mr. Barker, I will tell Mrs. Finch she has an admirer among the equine community. She will be insufferable. I am also glad." And just like that, Ida Leland had spoken to someone again. Not spoken precisely. Written. But it felt, in its way, like the same thing, like breath returning to a body that had been holding it too long. Over the following 2 weeks, the notes became letters, and the letters became longer. Dexter wrote to her about the horses in his care with the affection and dry humor of a man who genuinely loved animals even when they frustrated him. He wrote about the town as seen from the stable, which gave him an unusual perspective. He saw who came through, who was drunk before noon, which merchants were arguing with their suppliers, which cowboys were genuinely passing through, and which ones had come to stay. He wrote about things he had seen in the years before he came to Caldwell, which was not, she began to understand, a small number of years. He was 34, she eventually learned. He had grown up in Missouri, had drifted west after the war with a lot of other men who had no particular place to go, and had eventually stopped drifting when he came to Caldwell, and found that he was good with horses, and that the work settled something in him that years of moving had not. He had never married. He did not write this in a way that demanded sympathy or invited questions, just stated it as a fact the way he stated everything, plainly and without ornamentation. Ida found herself writing about Thomas. That surprised her most of all. She had not been able to speak his name in the weeks since the funeral without the words dissolving in her throat, but somehow on paper it was different. She could write. Thomas used to say that a man who was unkind to animals was never to be trusted with anything more complicated, and the sentence came out whole and right, carrying his voice in it without breaking. She wrote about how he had taught her to read the weather by watching the cattle, about how he had been a terrible cook, but had insisted on making breakfast every Sunday regardless, about the garden they had planted together each spring, and how those tomato plants she had watered were the last thing they had planted together. Dexter wrote back, "A man who was unkind to animals was never to be trusted. I agree with Thomas Leland. He sounds like he was someone worth knowing." Something about that not was, but sounds like he was, acknowledging the was without flinching from it, undid something in Ida that had been very tightly wounded. She sat at the kitchen table and cried for a long time, not the dry, desperate crying she had been doing since the funeral, but something deeper and cleaner, the kind of crying that actually does something useful, that clears a channel that had been blocked. By the time she was finished, she felt, for the first time in over a month, genuinely hungry. She made herself a proper meal and ate it at the table with Mrs. Finch watching her from the other chair with yellow eyes. The 5th week after Thomas's funeral, Ida Leland opened her front door. Not to go out, not yet. Just to stand in the doorway and let the morning air come in, the June heat already building even before 8 o'clock, the smell of the cattle trail and the cookfare smoke and the dry Kansas grass. She stood in the doorway in her black dress and her bare feet, and she watched the main road of Caldwell go about its morning business. And that was how she first saw Dexter Barker. She recognized him not by his face, which she had never seen, but by the way he moved. He was coming from the direction of Halloran's stable with a bay horse on a lead line, walking with the loose-limbed ease of a man who spent most of his time outdoors and had no interest in being hurried. He was not a tall man, perhaps an inch or two over her own height, but he was broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested real work rather than posturing. He wore a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up and a hat that had clearly seen better days and better decades. His hair was dark, shot through with gray at the temples. He was not what anyone would call classically handsome, but there was something in the arrangement of his face, something direct and calm and plainly honest, that made you want to keep looking at it. He stopped in front of the horse trough across from her door and let the bay drink. And then, in the way that a person sometimes feels another person looking at them even from a distance, he turned and looked directly at her door. He saw her standing there. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Dexter Barker lifted his hat from his head, held it briefly to his chest in a gesture of greeting that was also somehow a gesture of respect, and put it back on. He did not call out. He did not wave. He just looked at her with those plain, steady, dark eyes, and then he looked away and let the horse finish drinking. Ida stood in the doorway for a moment more. Then she went inside and sat down. Her hands, she noticed, were slightly unsteady. That evening she wrote to him, "I saw you this morning with the bay horse. He is handsome. The horse, I mean, though I should say that was not an insult directed at the man holding the lead rope." She had not intended to include that second part, but she had written it, and it was already on the paper, and she folded it and slid it under the door before she could reconsider. His reply the next morning, "I showed your note to the bay horse whose name is Franklin, and he agrees that he is extremely handsome. He has allowed this to go to his head somewhat. As for the man holding the rope, he thanks you for the qualification, and notes that he has been compared to worse things than a bay horse." D.B., she laughed again. She laughed easily now when she read his notes. It had become a thing she expected, a part of the morning that she organized around, and she understood that this was important, that the simple fact of having something to look forward to in the morning was not a small thing. It was, in fact, enormous. At the end of June, she received a note that said, "Mrs. Leland, I wonder if you might like to sit on your porch this Saturday evening. I could bring coffee. I will leave immediately if you prefer, or I will stay only as long as is comfortable, and I will talk about Gerald and Franklin exclusively if that helps. I only ask because I think you might be ready, but you know better than I do, and I will not be hurt in the slightest if the answer is no." D.B. Ida read it standing at the door, and she had to sit down. She understood what he was doing. He had been doing it all along, she realized now, not pushing, never pushing, just offering. A note, a word, a small window of light. And letting her be the one to decide whether to come to it or not. He had given her the power of it, and that was not something she had experienced very often, this gift of being met exactly where she was and not an inch further than she was willing to go. She wrote back, "Saturday evening. Coffee sounds fine. If Gerald or Franklin would also like to attend, please let them know they are welcome." She spent the rest of the week telling herself it was not a nervous anticipation she was feeling and doing a poor job of convincing herself. She swept the porch. She aired out the front of the house. She took down the black crepe from the window, because she had kept it up far past the usual period of mourning, and she understood now that it was not mourning she was honoring by keeping it there, but something else, some refusal to let the world see that life might be occurring again behind the glass. On Saturday evening, exactly when the sun began to lose its most brutal edge, she heard boots on the porch steps. Dexter Barker knocked. He did not simply come in, did not assume welcome, knocked as politely as a man calling on a church deacon. She opened the door and they looked at each other for a full moment without speaking. He had cleaned up for the occasion, she could see. The shirt was different, blue this time and pressed. The hat was brushed. He was holding 2 tin cups of coffee that he had evidently carried carefully from wherever he had made them, and he was looking at her with those straightforward dark eyes that she had only glimpsed from a distance and which, up close, were warm in a way that the distance had not allowed her to see. "Mrs. Leland," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected and careful like his handwriting. "Mr. Barker," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had anticipated. "You managed not to spill the coffee." Something in his face shifted, not a smile exactly, but the territory just before a smile. "I did drop a spoon," he admitted. "On the road. A man came out of Halloran's and asked if I was all right, and I told him I was merely practicing my balance, and he looked at me as if I had said something troubling and then walked away quite quickly." Ida stepped back and gestured to the 2 chairs she had set on the porch. "Come sit down," she said, "before the story gets longer." They sat on the porch in the long evening light and they talked. It was not the performance of conversation, not the careful social navigation she had been doing for years in this town, where everyone knew her business and half of them were kind about it, and the other half were not. It was real talking, the kind that happens when 2 people discover, with some surprise, that they are genuinely interested in what the other person has to say. He told her about the horses in his care. She told him about the garden. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father who had been a blacksmith and his mother who had been the most unsentimental woman he had ever met, and also the best person he had ever known. She told him about growing up in Ohio before she came to Kansas with Thomas, about how strange the plains had seemed to her, vast and flat and endless, how she had cried the first week, and then slowly come to understand that the sky was enormous here in a way that it was not in Ohio, that there was a kind of freedom in all that open space once you stopped being terrified by it. He listened in a way that most people did not listen, which was with his full attention, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually present with what she was saying. It was disconcerting at first, and then it was the most natural thing in the world. The sun went down. The piano started up in the saloon across the road. The street began to fill with the evening crowd, cowboys coming in off the trail, merchants closing their shutters, the particular mingling of the respectable and the not-so-respectable that was Caldwell after dark. "I should probably go," he said when the first stars appeared. "I said I would only stay as long as was comfortable." "It has been comfortable," Ida said, and she meant it. He stood up and gathered the tin cups. He looked at her for a moment in the dimming light. "Thank you," he said, "for the company. Thank you for the notes," she said, "all of them." Something moved across his face that she could not quite name. He nodded, replaced his hat, and walked down the porch steps and across the road, and she watched him go until the dark had absorbed him, and then she sat on the porch alone for a while longer, listening to the piano, looking at the stars that were enormous and close out here on the Kansas plain, and she breathed. He kept leaving notes. Even after that first evening, even when they had begun to meet on Saturdays, and then sometimes on a Wednesday too, slipping into a routine as naturally as water finds its own level, he still left a note under her door every morning. She had asked him once why he kept doing it when they were seeing each other in person now, and he had thought about it seriously before answering. "Because the morning is when it matters," he said. "When you first open your eyes and the day hasn't started yet and the world is still just the room around you. I want you to know every morning that there is someone who is thinking of you, not because he has to, because he wants to." Ida had looked at him for a long moment after that. "Dexter," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name just like that, without the Mr. in front of it. "Yes," he said, "you are going to make things very difficult for me." "I know it," he said quietly. "I am sorry. I am also not sorry at all." She had not laughed at that. She had done something that was harder, which was look at him with all her defenses slightly lowered, and let him see that she knew what he was saying and that she did not entirely disagree with it. The summer deepened into a real Kansas August, brutal and blistering and unforgiving, the kind of heat that makes the land shimmer at the edges like a mirage. Cattle moved through Caldwell in their thousands, the great drives coming up from Texas, and the town was loud and crowded and perpetually smelling of dust and manure, and the not always controlled excitement of men who had been riding for months and now had money in their pockets and intentions that varied widely in their respectability. Dexter was busy. The stable was full. The work was relentless, and Ida saw him less than she had become accustomed to seeing him, but the notes never stopped. Every morning, without exception, there was a note. Some were short, just a sentence, an observation, a small funny thing from the day before. Some were longer, written in the evening after the work was done, rambling and warm and carrying the clear evidence of a man who had spent the day thinking about what he wanted to say to her and then saying it. She wrote back every day too. She had found in the writing something that she had not expected to find, which was herself. The act of writing to him had become the act of discovering what she thought about things, because he asked questions that required actual consideration, not polite deflections, and she had to know what she thought before she could tell him. She had begun to come alive again. She also began to understand that this was not simply gratitude she felt for him, not the warmth of friendship or the relief of no longer being alone. It was something more particular and more urgent than that, something that sat in the chest like a coal that had been slowly adding heat for months, and which she now had to address honestly or pretend she could not feel it. On a Wednesday evening in late August, they were sitting on her porch, their usual spot, the familiar chairs, the familiar view of the main road, and a cattle drive was going through, raising a noise and a dust cloud that made conversation temporarily impossible, and they sat together in the noise and the dust, and at some point their shoulders were touching. Neither of them moved away. After the cattle had passed, when the air was beginning to settle and the dust was still hanging golden in the fading light, Ida said, "I need to tell you something, and I want to say it before I talk myself out of it." He turned to look at her. He did not say anything. "I have been keeping you at a particular distance," she said, "and I think you have known that, and I think you have been patient about it in a way that I am grateful for. But I want you to know that it is not because I am not—" She started again. "I am not indifferent to you, Dexter. I want that to be clear." He was quiet for a moment. The last of the cattle sounds were fading down the road. Somewhere in the saloon the piano had started. "I know it," he said. "I have known it for a while." "Then you are more confident than I am." "I am not confident," he said. I have been paying attention, that is all." Ida looked out at the road. "Thomas has been gone 4 months," she said. "I know that some people in this town think that is either too soon or somehow not soon enough. I cannot do anything about what people in this town think, but I think about it. I think about what it means to feel things again when you were not sure you were going to." "You don't owe anyone an explanation," he said. "Not even me." "I know," she said, "but I want to give you one anyway." He nodded. "Thomas was a good man," she said. "I loved him for 12 years, and I will love him for the rest of my life in the way that you love the people who shaped you, who walked through the important years beside you. That does not go away. I'm not trying to replace it. I know that is not what this is." She glanced at him just briefly. "But I think that grief and new feeling can exist in the same person at the same time, and I think it is not a betrayal of the past to let yourself be present. In the present." Dexter Barker looked at her with those steady dark eyes that had absolutely no capacity for dishonesty in them. "Ida," he said, and his voice was quieter than usual, careful with the word, careful with her name. "I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give. I want you to know that. But if you are telling me what I think you are telling me, I want you to also know that I have been—" He paused, and the pause was not awkward but deliberate, the pause of a man who does not say things unless he means them and therefore has to be sure first. "I have been turning toward you like a plant turns toward light all this summer. I did not plan it. It is simply what happened." The piano played. The stars came out. Ida looked at him for a long moment, and then she reached over and put her hand on top of his, where it rested on the arm of the chair, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them said anything, and the nothing they said was full of everything. They stayed that way until the night had fully settled and the street lamps were lit and the cicadas were raising their July song even though it was now August, and when she finally went inside and he walked home across the road, she stood at the window and watched him go and felt the coal in her chest give off a warmth that was no longer frightening. She let herself feel it. The next morning's note said simply, "Good morning, Ida. D." She read it standing at the door with her hair loose and her feet bare on the floorboards, and she pressed the paper briefly to her chest, and then she went to make coffee, humming a song she did not immediately recognize as the song that the piano had been playing the night before. September came in with a change in the air, that first cool edge that said the brutal summer was finally relenting. Ida replanted her garden for the autumn, pulling up what was done and turning the earth and putting in the things that wanted the cooler weather. Her hands were in the soil, which she had always found clarifying, and she was thinking about the notes, about the conversation on the porch, about the warmth of his hand holding hers, when she became aware that she was being watched. She looked up. A woman was standing at the fence along the side of the property, a tall woman, somewhere in her 40s, with a sharp face and sharp eyes and the upright posture of someone who had strong opinions about how things should be done. This was Helen Gruber, whose husband ran the dry goods store and who was the kind of woman who occupied herself very extensively with the affairs of her neighbors. "Ida," Helen said. Ida sat back on her heels and looked at the woman. "Helen, I am glad to see you outdoors. We were all concerned." "I know," Ida said. "That was kind of everyone." There was a pause in which Helen clearly intended to say something she had come there to say. "I couldn't help but notice," she said, "that you have been spending time of late with the man from Halloran's stable." Ida looked at her. "I only mention it," Helen continued, "because people do talk. Ida and Thomas has not been gone so very long, and it might be wise to consider what impression." "Helen," Ida said. Her voice was calm. She found that she was genuinely calm, which surprised her. "I appreciate your concern, I do. But I am 29 years old and I have earned the right to decide for myself who I spend my time with and when I spend it with them." Helen blinked. "If the town has opinions about what a widow should or should not do, the town is welcome to keep them," Ida said. "Thomas would not have wanted me to spend the rest of my life defined only by his absence. He was not that kind of man." She paused. "Dexter Barker is a good man. He has been kind to me. Whatever else may or may not come of it is my business, and I mean that kindly." Helen stood there for another moment, recalibrating. Then, to her credit, she said, "Well, I suppose you are right. I am fond of you, Ida. I do not want people to speak unkindly." "I know it," Ida said, and her voice softened. "I appreciate that, I truly do, but I cannot live in anticipation of unkind people. Nobody can." Helen gave a short, surprised nod, turned, and walked back toward the dry goods store. And Ida went back to her garden with her hands in the earth, and she felt something firm and clarified inside her, something that had been soft and uncertain all summer and was now taking on shape and edges. She was not going to be afraid of this. She was going to choose. That Saturday, when Dexter came to the porch, she was waiting for him at the door rather than inside it, which was new. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "You are standing outside," he observed. "I am," she said. "Is that significant?" "I thought we might take a walk," she said. "If you are willing. The evenings are cooler now, and I have not walked more than to the garden and back since the spring." He held out his arm. It was such a simple gesture, and she had not expected the way it would land, the warmth of it, the confidence of it. And she took his arm and they walked down the steps and along the main road of Caldwell, and she was, for the first time since June, simply a woman walking in the evening with a man she liked. And the world did not end, and the grief did not swallow her, and the people they passed who looked at them with curiosity did not have the power she had feared they would have. They walked to the edge of town, where the cattle trail widened out and the stars began, and the grass moved in the cooler air. And they stood there in the open evening and talked for a long time. He told her that he had been thinking about the future, not in the way of a man who had a plan he was presenting for her consideration, but in the way of a man who was beginning to want something he had not known he wanted and who was being honest about that. "I have not spent much time," he said, "in the past many years thinking about what comes next. I have mostly just managed what is in front of me, the horses, the work, the day." "And now?" she asked. He looked out at the dark prairie. "Now I think about more than the day," he said. "Now I think about what a life could look like, what it could contain." He glanced at her. "I think I would like it to contain you, Ida. If you should eventually want that." The wind moved through the grass. A coyote called somewhere to the west, distant and lonely, which in this moment seemed less lonely than it usually did. "I want to go slowly," she said, Not because I am uncertain, but because I want to do this right. I want us to know each other fully before we make anything permanent." "There is no hurry," he said. "You have been saying that since the first note," she said. "I have meant it every time." She believed him. And the believing was not work, not the effortful suspension of doubt. It was simply the natural consequence of months of evidence, of a man who had shown her, every single morning without exception, who he was and what he cared about and what she could expect from him. There was no mystery about Dexter Barker, or rather, the mystery was not in whether he could be trusted but in how someone had gotten to 34 without already being taken. She asked him that on the walk back, in a lighter tone than the one they had been using, and he laughed. "I was close once," he said. "In Missouri, before the war. There was a woman named Clara and I think we were two young people who were fond of each other and had no idea what else to do. The war interrupted it. When I came back, she was married to someone else, and when I saw her, I understood that I was glad for her, which told me it had not been what I thought it was." He paused. "I think I was waiting after that without knowing it, waiting for something that felt real enough to be worth staying in one place for." "Did you find it?" she asked. He looked at her sideways in the dark, that not quite smile at the edge of his mouth. "I believe I did," he said. She pressed her hand more firmly into the crook of his arm, and they walked back to her door. October arrived and the cottonwoods turned gold, and the mornings had a real bite to them now, the kind that made you see your own breath and felt like a clean announcement that the year was turning. Ida began to open her front door in the mornings to collect his notes with a cheerfulness that she recognized, with some private amusement, as almost indistinguishable from happiness. The notes had become elaborate things by now. He was a natural writer, it turned out, once he had found an audience he cared about. He wrote her observations about the world and small stories about the horses and thoughts about things he had read, because he was a reader too, which she had discovered with considerable pleasure. He kept a small shelf of books above his bunk at Halloran's, and they had begun to pass books between them and write about them in the notes, an ongoing conversation that wound through whatever else they were discussing. He had given her a copy of a book of poetry by Walt Whitman that a traveling bookseller had come through town with in September, and she had read it slowly and carefully, and had been moved by it in a way that she wrote to him about at length, and he had written back, "I knew you would understand it. I was not sure I understood it until I thought about giving it to you, and then I understood that the whole book is about what it means to be alive and to feel it, and I thought about you, and it made sense." She had read that note several times. She had also, by October, begun to meet him somewhere other than the porch. They walked together on Sunday evenings. They had once, on an unseasonably warm Saturday, ridden out to the creek east of town, she on a gentle mare he had brought for her, he on Franklin, the handsome bay who lived up to his billing, and they had sat by the water and eaten sandwiches she had packed, and it had been the most natural and beautiful afternoon she had spent since she did not know when. She found, as the weeks passed, that she was not grieving less. She was not grieving Thomas any less. The whole of his absence was still real and still had edges. But grief was no longer the only thing she was. She was also a woman who rode out to the creek and watched the light on the water and laughed at a man's stories about his impossible horse. Both of these things were true at the same time, and she had made peace with that. On a cold October evening, Dexter came to her door with something tucked under his arm. When she opened it, he was holding a small rectangular box that he was clearly uncertain what to do with. He held it out to her with the look of a man who has second-guessed this decision approximately 40 times on the walk over. "I made you something," he said. "You can tell me if it is strange or not useful." She took the box and opened it. Inside, nestled in a piece of flannel, was a small wooden box, the kind you might keep letters in, fitted with a latch and smoothly sanded, with a small carved design on the lid that she had to hold up to the lamplight to see properly. When she did, she saw that he had carved a bird, a finch, she realized with a start. "Mrs. Finch," she said. "Seemed fitting," he said, "for the letters." He looked at his own boots for a moment. "I did not want to presume that they were the kind of thing you would want to keep." But in case you did, Ida looked at the box for a long moment. The carving was careful and confident, the work of a man who was good with his hands in ways that went beyond horses, and the finch on the lid was actually quite beautiful, caught mid-wing as if just landing. She looked up at him. "Dexter," she said. "Yes." "Come inside," she said. "I'm going to make coffee and you are going to sit in the kitchen and not tell me this is presuming too much." He came inside. It was the first time he had been inside her house, and she could see him taking it in, the neat kitchen and the parlor beyond it, and the particular way she had arranged her life in the rooms that had been hers and Thomas's and were now only hers. He did not say anything about this. He sat in the chair she indicated, and she made coffee and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table with Mrs. Finch observing from the windowsill, and it was entirely comfortable, and it was the most she had wanted to say a thing that she was not yet saying. She kept the box on the table for the rest of the evening and moved all 30-something notes into it before he left. He saw her do it. The not-quite smile was fully a smile by then. November brought cold in earnest and the first spitting of sleet, and the trails quieted as the cattle drives wound down for the season, and Caldwell settled into the slower winter rhythm that was, in many ways, a relief. The work at the stable continued. Horses needed tending in winter as in summer, but the desperate press of the busy season was over, and Dexter had more time, and they used it. They used it in the way of two people who have been circling towards something and have finally acknowledged to each other that they are circling, and can therefore stop pretending they are not. He came to her kitchen several evenings a week now, and they cooked together, which was revelatory. He was, it emerged, a genuinely competent cook in the way of a man who had fed himself for 20 years and had developed actual opinions about it, and she was excellent, and together they made meals that were considerably better than what either of them had been eating alone. Mrs. Finch approved of Dexter. This was not a small thing. Mrs. Finch was deeply selective in her approval, and she demonstrated it toward Dexter by sitting on his boots whenever he remained still long enough, which he bore with a dignity that Ida found extremely endearing. They talked about everything. About Kansas and Ohio and Missouri, and the strange trajectory that had brought them each to this particular place at this particular time. About books and about the nature of the land they lived on, which was not land that anyone had always owned freely. Dexter spoke about this with a directness she respected. About how the plains had been taken from the people who had known them longest, the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, who had been pushed and forced and dispossessed through violence and treaty-breaking in ways that were still unresolved, and would take generations to fully reckon with, if they were ever reckoned with at all. He did not speak about it as a man performing conscience, but as a man who had seen things and thought about them honestly. She found that she had thoughts about it too, things she had observed in Caldwell, the way the world was organized here and who benefited from that organization and who did not. They talked about it the way you talk about hard things with someone you trust, which is without pretending the hard parts are not hard, but also without despair. They read together. They sat by her fire on cold evenings with their own books and occasionally read passages aloud to each other, which was a pleasure so domestic and so intimate that it sometimes made her catch her breath. December arrived. On the 1st of December, Dexter came to her door on a Sunday evening with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who has made a decision and is not sure how it is going to land. He was wearing his good shirt, which she recognized now as a signal that something was occurring, and he was carrying a small package which he set on the table by the door and then seemed to forget about immediately. "Ida," he said. "Yes," she said, watching him. "I have been thinking about something for quite a while," he said. "And I have been trying to determine the right time and the right way, and I have come to the conclusion that there is no perfect time, and that trying to engineer the perfect moment is a thing I am going to be doing until I am 80 if I let myself, and so I am going to say it now." "All right," she said. He looked at her with those honest dark eyes. "I love you," he said. I have loved you for a good while now. I am not saying this to rush anything or to change anything or to make you feel obligated in any direction. I am saying it because it is true and you deserve to know it." Ida stood very still. "I know that your heart has a whole history in it," he continued. "I know that Thomas Leland was in your life for 12 years, and that the love you had for him does not diminish, and I would not want it to, and I am not asking you to put it aside. I am saying that I have room for all of it, for all of you, including the parts that have already been through things I cannot fully understand. I would like to be with you, Ida. I would like to build something with you if you are willing. Not because I am trying to replace what you had, but because I think what we have is its own thing and it is real and it is worth choosing." The fire cracked. "Mrs. Finch jumped down from the windowsill and walked over to Dexter and sat on his feet with the authority of a creature who had already made up her mind. Ida looked at him. She thought about the first note, slipped under her door to a woman who had stopped speaking to the world. She thought about the tomato plants, and the peach-colored sky, and Gerald and his water bucket, and a man who had lifted his hat across a dusty road with nothing but quiet respect. She thought about the evening they had first sat together on the porch and talked until the stars came out. She thought about his hand turning over to hold hers, about his arm offered in the dark, about 30-something letters in a carved wooden box with a finch on the lid. She thought about Thomas, who had taught her how to love and who was in the ground and who she would always carry. And she thought about the strange, deep mercy of the fact that the heart does not fill up and run out of room, that it expands, that it can hold the dead and the living at the same time without either one crowding the other out. "I love you too," she said. Her voice was steady. "I have been waiting to be sure enough to say it, and I am sure." He let out a breath that told her he had been considerably less certain of this outcome than he had appeared. "Can I also say," she added, "that Mrs. Finch has been on your side from approximately the 3rd week." He looked down at the cat on his feet. "Smart animal," he said. "Smarter than both of us," Ida said. He crossed the room in 2 steps and took her hands in his, and when she tilted her face up toward him and he kissed her, it was gentle and unhurried and entirely true, nothing performed about it, nothing borrowed from any story that had come before. They stood in the kitchen in the firelight with Mrs. Finch observing, and Ida felt the world rearrange itself quietly around her, not violently, not with the crash of the old world ending, but gently, the way a season changes, the way morning comes. He had been going to ask her to marry him, he admitted, and had talked himself into having that particular conversation on a separate occasion rather than layering it onto this one. She told him that was probably wise, and he agreed, and they sat down by the fire and talked about it nonetheless, because it turned out that once you said the important thing you had been building to, the next important things were right there waiting. "I want to wait a little longer," she said. "Not because of you. Because of how I wanted to feel. I wanted to feel chosen completely, not like something I did before I was fully ready." "Tell me when you are ready," he said simply. "I will," she said. "I know it," he said. The winter passed in the specific warmth of 2 people who have declared themselves to each other and are now in the pleasure of the early intimacy, the discovery of all the small details that deepen knowledge of another person. He learned that she could not sleep past 5 in the morning, no matter how late she had stayed up. She learned that he had a particular low hum he made when he was thinking, almost subvocal, a sound like an engine idling, that she found unexpectedly endearing. He learned that she cried at certain passages of books and was completely unself-conscious about it. She learned that he was afraid of very little, but had a genuine and inexplicable aversion to spiders that he acknowledged with the equanimity of a man who has accepted his own peculiarities. In January, he moved Mrs. Finch off a chair and sat down in it, and Mrs. Finch sat on him instead. And this was the moment Ida understood that the house, which had been too quiet for too long, had gradually and without announcement become a place where another person was entirely at home. February still cold with the Kansas wind coming off the plains with real purpose, and they were sitting by the fire on a Friday evening, she with a book and he with a ledger he was trying to reconcile for Halloran, who was not a natural bookkeeper, when she set her book down and said, "Dexter." He looked up. "March," she said. "I think March." He understood immediately. She could see it in his face. He put the ledger on the side table and gave her his full attention. "March," he said, "the beginning of the month, while the weather is still cold enough that it feels like beginning something rather than continuing summer." She paused. "Something small, just the people we care about, not a production. I do not know many people well enough to invite them," he said, which was not false. Dexter was a man of few but solid connections, and the ones he had were genuine. "I know a few," she said. "The minister, perhaps the Halloran family, since they have been good to you. My neighbor Mrs. Wills, who has brought me bread every winter since Thomas died and has never once made me feel managed." She smiled. "And Gerald and Franklin in spirit, if not in person." He laughed. "I will tell them. Gerald will use it as an excuse to destroy another bucket." She came to the 1st of March with a clarity and a readiness that she had promised herself she would wait for, and she had it. The morning of the wedding she stood at her mirror in the room that had been hers and Thomas's and looked at herself in the dress she had chosen, which was not black and was not white but a deep green that suited her coloring and that she had made herself over the preceding weeks, and she said quietly to the room, "I am happy, Thomas. I want you to know that. I think you would like him." The room did not answer, of course. But it did not feel hostile either, did not feel like a violation. It felt, oddly, like permission. The minister was Reverend Lowe, who had been the minister at Thomas's funeral, and who had called on Ida twice in the months after, and whom she respected because he had never used his calling on her as an excuse for intrusion. He performed the ceremony in his church with the small group Ida had described, the Halloran family, meaning old Tom Halloran and his wife Jean, their 2 grown sons, and the neighbor Mrs. Wills, who arrived early and cried first and cried most and was entirely unapologetic about both. Dexter stood at the front of the church in a dark coat she had never seen on him before, which meant he had acquired it for this day, and which fit him as if it had been made with some attention. He was watching her come up the aisle with the expression of a man who is seeing exactly what he hoped to see and can hardly quite believe it. She reached him and took his hands and looked at him. "You got a new coat," she said quietly. "I did," he said, equally quiet. "It suits you." "It does," he agreed with a not-quite smile. Reverend Lowe performed the ceremony with appropriate brevity and genuine warmth, and when Dexter said the words of the vow, he said them with the same directness and plain honesty with which he said everything, looking straight at her, meaning every word as literally as words could be meant. When Ida said her vows, she had slightly modified the traditional language because she had thought about it carefully and she wanted it to be accurate. She said, "I give you my heart as it is, whole and also scarred, and I trust you with the whole of it, the present and the past. I will walk this life with you honestly and with love." Reverend Lowe had read her draft of the vows beforehand and approved them without comment. When Dexter kissed her in the small cold church in March in Caldwell, Kansas, the year 1879, Mrs. Wills made a sound that could best be described as triumphant weeping. The life they built together was not a quiet one, exactly, because Caldwell was not a quiet town, and 1879 was not a quiet year. There was always something happening, a new crowd of cowboys on the trail, a dispute at the saloon that spilled into the street, the ongoing business of a cow town living at the edge between the settled and the untamed. But the life they built was grounded in a way that neither of them had fully experienced before, grounded in the specific knowledge that what was happening in the house at the end of the road was real and tended and mutual. Dexter continued at Halloran's stable through the spring, but by summer he had made an arrangement with old Tom Halloran, who was looking for reasons to rest his aging back, to take over the running of the stable, an investment that required most of his savings and a loan from the Caldwell Bank, and a series of negotiations that Ida was present for. keeping notes at the table while the men talked, occasionally inserting a clarifying question that redirected the entire conversation in useful ways, and which Dexter afterwards said were the most valuable contributions made at the table. "You should have done the negotiating yourself," she told him that evening. "Next time," he said, "I will simply send you and stay home with Mrs. Finch." The stable did well. Dexter had a reputation with horses that was not accidental, built over years of genuine care and expertise, and as Caldwell grew and the cattle trade continued to expand through 1879 into 1880, the stable was busy and profitable. He hired a young man named Samuel, 17 and eager, who had come to Caldwell from Missouri with the specific ambition of working with horses, and who turned out to have a natural talent for it, and whom Dexter took on as an apprentice with the same patient, unhurried teaching that had characterized everything else he did. Ida had begun selling things from her garden in the late spring, which she had not done when Thomas was alive because the garden had been smaller and they had needed what it produced. But she had expanded it over the winter with plans and attention, and by summer of 1879, she had more tomatoes and beans and corn and various herbs than she and Dexter could use or preserve. And the women who bought from her in the market stall she set up on Tuesday mornings were also, whether she had planned it or not, the beginning of a genuine community. She had not realized, until she had deliberately stepped away from it, how much she had been needed in Caldwell or how much she needed it in return. There were women in this town who were not as fortunate as she was, women whose husbands were absent or worse than absent, women with children and limited resources, and no one to help them think through the options. Ida had lived in that particular vulnerability after Thomas died, had felt the edges of what it meant to be a woman alone in a frontier town where property and legal rights were tangled and insufficient, and she understood it in her body in a way that made her useful to other women in a way that nothing else could. She became, in the way of capable women in small towns throughout history, someone that people came to with problems. Not official, not appointed, just real. Dexter watched this happen with a pride that was entirely free of jealousy, which she noted and was grateful for. He said once, when she had come home late from helping a woman on the edge of town navigate an argument with a landlord who had no legal standing for his position, "You are extraordinary, you know." "I am practical," she said. "Those are sometimes the same thing." They were sitting in the kitchen, the fire going, late in October of 1879, and she was telling him about what had happened, and he was listening with that full attention of his. And she looked at him across the table and thought with a quiet overwhelm that was by now familiar. How extraordinary that a folded piece of ledger paper slipped under a door could lead here, to this warm room, to this man, to this life. In November of 1879, Ida told him she was expecting. She had known for a few weeks and had been certain of it for at least 10 days before she told him, because she had wanted to be sure, but also because she had been carrying the knowledge privately like something very fragile, turning it over and over, feeling the complicated topography of joy and fear that she knew too well from the pregnancies she and Thomas had lost. She told him on a Tuesday morning before he went to the stable, sitting at the kitchen table with the early winter light coming through the window, and his face did a thing she had not seen it do before, a kind of opening, all of his careful restraint dissolving at once into something unguarded and extraordinary. He reached across the table and took both her hands. "Ida," he said, and stopped. "I know," she said. "I know it is. I know there is fear mixed into it. I want you to know that I have thought about it carefully and I am hopeful, not frightened. Or rather, I am both, but the hope is larger." "What can I do?" he said. "Exactly what you have always done," she said. "Be here, be steady. Leave me a note in the morning." He laughed at that, wet-eyed and slightly undone, which was the most she had ever seen him show in one moment, and it made her love him with a freshness that surprised her every time it happened. That winter was the warmest passage she had known in Kansas, not in temperature, The temperature was brutal, but in the sense of being wrapped in something that held. She was sick through December and into January, the ordinary morning misery of early pregnancy, and Dexter was steadfast without being smothering, brought her crackers and willow bark tea at the right moments and did not hover, did not treat her like an invalid, understood that what she needed was care and not management, which was not a distinction that all people grasped. The notes continued, every single morning without exception. She had said once that she hoped he never stopped, and he had said that he would not, and she had understood that this was not a promise lightly made, and it was not a promise lightly kept either, because there were mornings when he was up before 4 with a sick horse or a foaling emergency, and he still found a moment, somehow, to write something and slip it under the door before she was up. One morning in January, when she had been particularly unwell, and had slept badly, and was lying in bed wondering how the human race had continued to perpetuate itself, given how wretched this stage of the process was, the note had said simply, "You are doing something magnificent. Even when it feels terrible." And she had clutched the paper to her chest and stared at the ceiling, and thought that she had never been so known by anyone, and that it was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. The baby came in late July of 1880, and he was a boy, and he was loud and outraged from the first moment, which the midwife Mrs. Crandall said was an excellent sign, and Ida held him in the high summer heat of the Kansas morning, and looked at his scrunched, furious face, and felt a love so large and immediate and absolute that she understood she had no category for it. They named him Thomas Dexter Leland Barker, which was a name that carried both worlds in it, the past and the present, the man who had shaped her and the man who had chosen her. And when she told Dexter the name she had been thinking about, he had to stand very still for a moment before he could respond. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I am sure," she said. "Thomas would have approved of you. I want the boy to carry both." "Thomas," Dexter said quietly, looking at the baby. "Welcome to Kansas, son. I should warn you in advance about Gerald." Ida laughed, and so did Mrs. Crandall, who had heard many new fathers in her years of midwifery, but not one who began with a horse. The year Thomas was a baby was the year that Caldwell reached its peak as a cow town, 1880 going into 1881. The great cattle drives at their height, the town louder and wilder and more prosperous and more dangerous than it had ever been. Dexter's stable was at the center of it, busy every day from before dawn until after dark, Samuel now joined by 2 additional hands, the whole operation something that Dexter ran with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. Ida watched her husband work and was not surprised by how good he was at it, but was always glad to be reminded. He was the kind of man that other men trusted without particularly analyzing why, which was, she had decided, because his trustworthiness was not performed or strategic but simply structural, built into how he was. Cowboys who came through Caldwell once and came back through a year later looked for Dexter Barker's stable specifically, and the word about its quality spread in the way that genuine quality spreads, which is quietly and through people telling people. Gerald, she should note, had eventually been retired from active service due to advanced age and lived out his days in the pasture behind the stable, kicking over the occasional bucket out of nostalgia and being generally magnificent about it. In the spring of 1882, Ida became pregnant again. She was 32 by then, and Dexter was 38, and Thomas was a sturdy, loud-voiced, horse-obsessed almost 2-year-old who had Dexter's steady eyes and Ida's stubbornness, and who had already been introduced to Franklin the bay horse, with consequences that mainly involved Thomas sitting on the horse's back, looking exactly like a person who had finally found his correct position in the world. The second pregnancy was easier than the first, as if her body had learned the shape of it and was making accommodations. The baby was a girl, born in November of 1882, and they named her Clara Ruth, the Clara for the woman Dexter had told her about once, the almost of his past that he had been glad to let go, and the Ruth for Ida's mother. Clara Ruth Barker was born with a disposition entirely opposite to her brother's. Where Thomas was loud and insistent, Clara was watchful and quiet, with enormous dark eyes that examined everything with the precision of a small scientist. She grew into a child who was interested in everything and afraid of nothing, who by the time she was 3 was following her father around the stable asking questions about every horse, learning their names and their habits and their preferences with the same focused attention that Dexter brought to everything he loved. Thomas and Clara fought constantly and were absolutely devoted to each other, which Ida recognized as the authentic form of sibling love. Mrs. Finch died in the winter of 1882, peaceful and old and beloved in her chair by the fire, and Ida cried for a good portion of a day, and Dexter understood why without asking, because Mrs. Finch had been there for all of it from the beginning, the first small living presence in the silent house of a widow who had stopped speaking to the world. He buried her in the garden in the corner near the tomatoes, and made a small marker for her, which he carved himself, and which said only, "Mrs. Finch, a woman of strong opinions." Caldwell changed as the 1880s went on. The cattle drives began to slow as the Kansas pastures filled with farming settlements, and the ranges closed, as the railroads extended south, and the need for the great trail drives diminished. The town that had been one of the wildest on the frontier began to quiet, a process that was both a relief and a kind of ending, the closing of a chapter that had been vivid and dangerous and irreplaceable. Some of the men who had shaped the town moved on. Some of the establishments that had defined it shuttered or transformed. Dexter's stable adapted. As the cattle trade slowed, the need for working horses remained. Farming required horses. The growing permanent population required horses, and Dexter began to shift toward breeding as well as boarding and working, developing a reputation for the quality of his horses that extended well beyond Caldwell and brought buyers from considerable distances. Ida had by 1884 something that had organized itself into a real operation, a large garden that supplied the town's restaurant and several households, herbs that she dried and sold to the doctor and the pharmacist, and a knowledge of practical medicine that she had assembled from books and from the town's doctor, old James Pryor, who had recognized her intelligence and her organizational capability, and had begun consulting her informally on cases that required careful thinking. She was not a doctor and had no pretense of being one, but she was a person who could listen carefully, think clearly, and communicate plainly. And in a frontier town with one elderly physician, those qualities were useful in ways that exceeded formal training. When Ida was 35 and Dexter was 41, on an evening in October that had the quality of all the good October evenings they had accumulated over the years, the fire going, the children finally asleep, the house in the particular quiet that follows the cessation of children, he came and sat next to her on the settee rather than in his chair, which was unusual enough that she put her book down and looked at him. "I have been thinking," he said. "You have been humming for about an hour," she confirmed. "So I suspected," he smiled. "I want to build you a proper house." She looked at him. "Not to replace this one," he said quickly. "I know what this house is to you. But there is that piece of land east of town, the one near the creek where we rode that first time, and I have been looking at it for a year, and it is the right land for what I am thinking, which is a proper house with a proper garden and a barn for the horses, and room for the children to grow, and a kitchen that is not quite so small," she said. "I was going to say intimate," he said, "but yes." She thought about the house on the main road that had been hers and Thomas's and then hers alone and then theirs. She thought about the window where she had sat for those long weeks of silence, watching the world pass. She thought about the door and the gap at the bottom of it through which the first folded note had appeared. "Could we keep this house?" she asked. "For the town, I mean. For the women who need somewhere to be when they are figuring out what comes next." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Ida, that is a fine idea, and it is also exactly the sort of idea that does not surprise me even slightly when it comes from you. We would need to manage it somehow, she said. We would, he said, but I think we know people who could help with that. He paused. Mrs. Wills, for one. Ida smiled. Mrs. Wills had become, in the years since the wedding, one of the most consistently present figures in their lives, a woman of tremendous heart and absolutely zero tolerance for nonsense, who had become something of a grandmother figure to Thomas and Clara, and who had strong opinions about how things should be run and was usually right. She will run the whole thing herself if we ask her, Ida said. We can make it official, Dexter said. Give her a title, give her a budget. She will want to be called director, Ida said. Then director it is. They broke ground on the new house in spring of 1885 on the land by the creek, and Dexter was deeply involved in its design with a local builder, coming home in the evenings with amended plans and ideas and questions for Ida about what she needed and wanted, because the kitchen was entirely hers to specify, and the garden space was sized to her vision, which was considerable. The house was finished in the fall of 1885, and moving into it was strange and right at the same time. Strange because it was new, unmarked by any previous life, without the particular weight and warmth of history that the house on the main road had. Right because it was entirely theirs, nothing borrowed or inherited, just chosen. Every room decided together. The bookshelf in the sitting room built to their specific requirements, which were extensive on both their parts. The house on the main road became, with Mrs. Wills at its center, a place of refuge for women in difficult circumstances. It was not a formal institution. This was 1885 in Kansas, and formal institutions for such things were not readily available. But it was real and known and used, and in the first year it had housed 5 women and their collective 9 children at various points of transition, and it had helped 3 of them navigate legal situations that would have been overwhelming without assistance, and it had fed a great many people, and it had done all of this quietly and without ceremony, which was how Ida had always done things that mattered. Thomas had turned 5 in July of 1885, a furious and loving child who spent most of his time either at the stable with his father or in the kitchen with his mother, and who had recently announced his intention to have horses and a garden, a plan that Ida told Dexter represented excellent professional planning. Clara was 3, and already making decisions about things with a firmness that suggested she would be entirely capable of running Caldwell herself by the age of 12. She had also, for reasons no one fully understood, decided that Mrs. Finch's old chair was her chair, and she sat in it during the evenings with a very particular air of occupying a throne. One December evening in 1885, when the new house was still unfamiliar enough to be surprising in small ways, the different sound of the wind, the different view from the bedroom window, Ida was sitting up after the children were asleep, reading by the fire. Dexter came in from the last check on the stable, which he and Samuel did every night before turning in, and he took off his coat and his boots and came to sit beside her. He had brought in a small rush of cold air with him that the room quickly absorbed, and she leaned against him without looking up from her book, and he put his arm around her and they were quiet for a while. "Ida," he said. "I leave you a note every morning." "You do," she said. She still had them all, everyone, in the wooden box with the finch on the lid. The box was full several times over by now, and she had added a second box beside it and was working on filling a third. "I am going to keep doing that," he said. "I know it," she said. "Just wanted it to be stated." She put her book down and looked at him. He was 41 years old, and the gray at his temples had spread, and the lines of his face had deepened with the outdoor years, and he was the most familiar thing in her world, familiar in the way of something that has been trusted long enough to become necessary. "Do you remember the first one?" she asked. "Word for word," he said. "Do you?" "Word for word," she said. "Mrs. Leland, I know you don't know me," he began. "I am Dexter Barker," she continued, and there was a particular tone in her voice when she said his name now after all these years that was different from how she had said it the first time, weighted with the specific gravity of a name that had come to mean home. "I work at Halloran's stable," he went on. "I am sorry about your husband," she said, and the saying of it was gentle as it always was. Thomas Leland's name and his memory lived in this house as it should, honored and held. "I do not expect a reply," Dexter said. She laughed softly. "You did not expect a reply." "I hoped for one," he admitted, "but I told myself not to. And then I replied." "And then you replied," he said, "and I went and sat on a bucket in the stable for approximately 20 minutes because I did not know what to do with the feeling." She looked at him with delight. "You never told me that." "It seemed like an undignified detail at the time," he said. "In retrospect, it is foundational." She settled more firmly against him, her head on his shoulder, the fire warm, the children asleep, the night quiet around the house by the creek where the cottonwoods were bare, and the stars were brilliant and enormous in the Kansas sky. "Dexter," she said. "Ida," he said. "I am glad you left that note." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I am glad you answered." Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood branches with a sound like paper, like a letter being unfolded, like the first word of something that, once started, had decided it was not going to stop. The morning came, as it always did, with the light finding its way through the east-facing window. Ida Leland Barker woke to the pale December sun, and the sound of Thomas's voice already going somewhere in the house. The child had no low settings, and the distant sounds of the stable, and the smell of coffee that Dexter had clearly started before she woke, because that was the kind of man he was. She put her feet on the cold floor and reached for the shawl on the chair and wrapped it around herself. And she went to the bedroom door and down the hall to the kitchen, where the coffee was hot, and the fire was going, and Clara was sitting in the corner drawing something in the dirt with a stick she should not have been allowed to bring inside. On the kitchen table, propped against the coffee pot, was a small folded piece of paper. It was, she knew, the note for today. She picked it up and unfolded it, as she had done every single morning since the 12th day of her widowhood, when a man she did not know had slipped a piece of torn ledger paper under her door and asked nothing in return, and had thereby, slowly and gently and entirely honestly, brought her back to life. The note today said, in that careful, familiar hand, "The sky this morning is the color of a peach that's just about perfect. I thought someone should notice it. D." She smiled. He had written her these exact words once before, in the very early days, the third or fourth note. He had not forgotten, and she had not forgotten, and neither of them would forget. She held the paper against her chest for a moment, looked out the kitchen window at the Kansas sky, which was indeed exactly that color, and felt the morning open around her, full and bright and entirely, completely hers. Thomas came running in with his boots in his hands and his hair going in several directions, demanding breakfast and information about horses and the current state of Gerald's legacy. And Clara stood up from the corner with her stick and joined the conversation at full volume. And Dexter came in from outside with the cold air and that look on his face, the steady, warm, particular look of a man who has come into the room he wants to be in, and he caught her eye over the children's heads. And she folded the note and put it in her pocket. The day began. Every morning without fail the note was there. Every morning without fail she opened it and read it and put it in the box with all the others. The boxes multiplied over the years, lined up on the shelf in the sitting room that Dexter had built for them. Dozens of notes, hundreds of notes, a whole life of small moments set down in careful handwriting on whatever paper was available, ledger sheets, the backs of receipts, pages torn from worn-out books, proper writing paper when he was feeling ceremonious. Thomas grew into a young man who was exactly as horse-obsessed as his early years had suggested, tall like neither of his parents but long-limbed and easy in his body, with his mother's particular kind of intelligence that moved quietly and comprehensively through whatever it addressed. He was 14 when he began working seriously at the stable, and 18 when he and Samuel together outperformed every horse trainer in 3 counties at a regional competition that drew buyers from across Kansas and into Missouri. And Dexter watched this with a satisfaction so complete it was difficult to articulate, and so he did not try to articulate it, but only put his hand on his son's shoulder and said quietly, "Your grandfather Thomas would have said that a man who was good to horses was never to be trusted with anything less." Thomas Barker looked at his father and said, with a grin that was pure Ida, "You have that backward." "I know it," Dexter said, "but you understood me." Clara, at 16, announced that she intended to study medicine, which announcement was made with a complete absence of qualification or apology. Ida looked at her daughter across the kitchen table and felt a pure undiluted pride that required no words to express but which she expressed anyway, at length and with specificity, because she had learned over the years that the things most worth saying should be said out loud. The world was changing around Caldwell as the decade turned into the 1890s, the frontier closing, the wildness settling into something more established, more organized. The great cattle drives were memory now, and the town had a different character, less violent and less vivid in some ways, more permanent in others. Dexter was 50 years old in the summer of 1894, and he did not seem, to Ida's eyes, any older than the man she had watched cross a dusty road with a horse on a lead line in 1878, except that he was better settled more deeply into himself, more at ease, carrying his years in the way of a man who had spent them on things worth spending them on. She was 44 herself, and she looked at the two of them in the small mirror above the washstand sometimes, her dark hair now threaded through with gray, and she thought, "There we are. There is the life that was built from a folded piece of ledger paper, and a widow who had gone quiet, and a man patient enough to keep writing until she was ready to answer. She had a box of notes that filled an entire shelf. She had a husband who still, without exception, without fail, left one under her door every morning. She had children who were growing into themselves with confidence and direction. She had a house by a creek where the cottonwoods went gold every October and the sky was enormous and close. She had the memory of Thomas Leland, honored and present, carried without weight, without the old pain, with only the clean love of remembrance. She had a town that she had helped to shape, in the quiet ways of capable women who do not wait for official permission, the refuge house on the main road still operating under Mrs. Wills, now in her 70s and absolutely not slowing down. She had, in short, everything. One morning in the autumn when the light was exactly right, that particular October gold that never failed to stop her, she found the morning note and unfolded it, and it said, "Ida, I have been leaving you notes for 16 years, and I have not yet run out of things to say. I do not expect I ever will. I love you in the morning and in the evening, and in the particular way that comes from knowing someone for so long that they have become part of how you understand the world. I remain, as always, yours." D. She stood at the kitchen window with the note in her hands and the October light coming through, and the horses moving in the pasture behind the house and the sounds of her household waking around her. And she thought about the woman who had stopped speaking, who had sat in a chair and watched the world pass and could not begin. How remarkable, she thought, that a note under a door could be the beginning of a life. How remarkable that someone had known somehow that what she needed was not rescue or management or comfort or pity, but only the simple radical act of being seen. Of having someone say, in effect, "I know you are there. I am here too, I ask nothing. I only want you to know." She took a piece of paper from the shelf. She wrote as she had written for 16 years a reply. She wrote, "Dexter, I love you in the morning too. Come to breakfast. The coffee is getting cold and Mrs. Finch II has taken your chair again. Yours always, Ida." She set it on the table where he would find it and went to pour the coffee. And when he came in from the stable with the cold air and the hay dust and that look on his face, the look that had not changed in 16 years, the look that said, "I am exactly where I want to be," she handed him the cup and he read the note and he smiled and put it in his pocket. And they had breakfast in the golden October morning with their children and their loud, wonderful life. And the day was good. And all the days after it were good. And Ida Leland Barker, who had once stopped speaking to the world, found that she never ran out of things to say.